is that one going as well? Okay.
Yeah. Let me just...
Just so you can see. Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
So Olivia, Nick Law, who I spoke with on the video, I don't know which way it is, here, he, even before we filmed together on that Zoom chat, he said, the person you have to speak to is Olivia. And I was he was quite surprised I didn't know about your book or your research. So I started looking around thinking, and saw a bunch of different interviews that you'd done. And started thinking, actually, I've spoken to 60 people or more associated to Soul Survivor. And the things that you were saying and that you were relaying were so similar to people my age and younger who'd been through Soul Survivor. And they were at a stage where some had become vicars and then even recently stopped being vicars. Some had kind of rejected their faith entirely and regret not living in a way perhaps that they see their kids or current culture living.
Yeah.
Others who, well, most of them didn't want to speak to me. Others who were still in the evangelical kind of tradition seemed to suggest other things as well. But mostly what you'd called deconstruction, Nick was saying, Sam, you just need to look into this.
Yeah.
And I think there's a part of me that thinks I'm unique and different. I'm not deconstructing. But I think it's probably a fair thing to say that is and has been what I've been doing. But I thought, and thank you very so much for coming here and having a chat. But really, I think to start out, what was the research that you did? Why did Nick suggest I needed to speak with you? And what kind of similarities did you see in some of the things we've spoken about or the odd video that I've tried to make that you thought, yeah, there's something that you're doing which is more universal than just you or Soul Survivor or whatever?
Yeah, I think, so the research that I did, I think some years ago, I was going through I think it's a lifelong process, but I was going through what I now recognise has the label deconstruction. And that's, I think to frame that word, it's not an ideal word, it's not an ideal term. It is the term that people are using at the moment. And I think for a lot of people, it doesn't feel like it exactly fits what they're going through, but it's a useful word to kind of connect to. So the way that I sort of put it in when I wrote the book was a real profound process of sort of unraveling something, a process of real change in your faith.
Yeah.
I didn't define where you should therefore end up, because I don't think that's not the point at all. Because you could end up anywhere, and you could not end up anywhere. You can keep going on an endless journey of discovery, really. And as you say, people end up all over the map. And the people I spoke to, some of them are maybe atheists now. Some of them are just sort of trying to figure out what they believe. Some of them are ordained. Some of them, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think in going through that process myself, I kind of thought, well, there's stuff out there, lots of stuff out there from an American point of view. And I do think it's just a different context. And there's quite a lot of stuff out there from people who were quite well known. But where's the stuff that's from a British point of view? Where's the stuff that is from just ordinary people who've, been the keen one in the youth group and maybe done some short-term mission and sat in a pew for years or decades? Where's that stuff? And then I kind of thought, oh, well, I should write that stuff. And then I thought, no, I really shouldn't. That's just way too scary. And then we went into lockdown. So this kind of started, I suppose the real start of this was in the first lockdown. And over time, I put together a survey, which I put online, quite an in-depth survey. I thought I might get maybe 50 people filling it in. Ended up, I closed it at 400. And I asked people, it was completely anonymous unless people chose to leave contact details and offer to be interviewed. And about 200 people offered to be interviewed. I ended up interviewing about 150, which was amazing, and a real privilege to hear people's stories, the good, the bad and the ugly. And for some of them, probably a minority, that process had been one of just a careful unpacking of theology and figuring out what they believed about the divine, about all that kind of stuff. But for most people, unfortunately, it was a much more difficult process, often involving quite controlling church spaces, quite coercive church spaces. And I don't use those words lightly.
No.
I previously had done some work sort of linking in with domestic violence, and I think there are big overlaps between coercive control and what is going on in some parts of the church, not all of it, some parts of it, and the culture which is created around that. It's interesting, I think, in the Scolding report about Soul Survivor, it speaks a bit to the culture that was created, and I don't think I know that's not in any way unique to Soul Survivor.
And I think it's probably worth talking, let's frame it around that a little bit. So when I was preparing and thinking about how we could have a conversation, I can quite easily put my feet up in church is kind of behind me my negative experiences of church behind me, I just need to move on. But actually, as I was thinking about it, I still need to be angry about this stuff. I still need to be, I want to be critical with you as we have this conversation about our experiences, some of which are probably fairly similar, maybe. So one of the things I started doing as I was researching was, with Soul Survivor, what was it that made it so universally attractive, and everyone seemed to agree that the approach was right. And I saw that in 1998, Mike Pilavachi with Craig Boulez, or I don't know how to pronounce his name, wrote a book, and they wrote all sorts of books, but I think that book in 98 was the one that I remember reading. I would have been 18 then, and it was How Living the Life or something. And I just read the first 27 pages that were free on Google to remind me, I don't know where the book is. And Pilavachi name drops Matt Redman being with him, and this whole culture of referring to the Soul Survivor way.
Yeah.
And marrying that. And at the beginning of the book, it says, you should keep your Bible to one hand because there's going to be lots of biblical references that you want to look up while you're reading this. So I'm being trained as an 18-year-old reading this. I need to have my Bible and this book, and these two things will inform how to live the life. Now, for me, that I then did a gap year with them because I'd bought into it. So everything that I was told throughout that process, and then how that informed my youth group, all of those things. I went to the festival each year. We went each month to the monthly celebrations. This teaching, the book, the CDs, all of these things, I've got this in one hand, I've got the Bible in the other.
Yeah, and that is teaching you also the framework through which you should read your Bible.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite a key thing. I mean, I remember being told in a number of different spaces, church and mission, you shouldn't study theology because it might make you question your faith. But you can read these particular books that we tell you which ones you're allowed to read.
And you're now studying.
I'm now doing a PhD in theology, so broke all the rules. And yes, it has made me, even before I was doing this, but actually starting to read bits of theology and kind of go, oh wow, there's all these different ways of looking at the cross, and the one that I was told was the only one is actually pretty niche, and quite recent and quite Western, and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
There's all these ways of understanding the divine, which actually a lot of them are a lot more embodied and a lot more perhaps true to my experience of life than this idea of God who is always he, who is, angry with me if I do this and loves me if, and this kind of stuff. And I think that kind of thing of, these are the books you're allowed to read and this is how we frame the Bible, does create, it creates quite a perhaps safe feeling box, because I know what the rules are. But actually,
and it creates a language, a
yes,
shared language.
yes, and a culture.
And a
Yeah.
culture. So
Yeah.
so if everyone else, and using my word language, like as culture, I suppose, you know the right words to use.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a conversation. If you go to Spain and you can't speak Spanish, you
Yeah.
kind of struggle. You view it from the outside.
Yeah,
If you can speak Spanish, you can integrate.
yeah,
And there's that thing of, you're taught the language with those two books. You're taught how to respond in situations, just as you do when you go to another country. That culture is something that you are then part of.
yes,
How does, and I think, so that married with the other side of it is, you're taught how to do that in response to faith, but you also find your people that speak
Yeah.
to you, and you hear, you understand,
Yeah.
you can relate. There's no need for translation.
yeah. And I don't think there's anything wrong inherently with either of those two things. You know, we are cultural creatures. We need to create a culture. We need to belong. We need to find our people, just as humans. And I think to an extent, every culture and subculture does that. I think the problem becomes when that culture becomes controlling and you cannot question it. And if you do, or if you reject parts of it, if you don't buy into the whole package, you're out. And that's where it becomes more dangerous.
So why is it, and I couldn't see it, and could you, why is it when you're in it, you can't see that you're in that? What is it that you learn?
I think it's a number of things. So I think at one level, there's a lot of talk about freedom and liberty and grace and this kind of stuff. And I think it is quite easy to coast along on that because it sounds great.
Yeah.
And who doesn't want those things? Of course we want those things. So believing, I think when any group believes its own PR, and it's quite easy to believe the PR.
Yeah.
And actually, of course, there are genuinely lovely people in those spaces. And certainly that's what,
loads.
that's why I joined, because
Yeah.
people were really genuinely nice to me as a slightly miserable teenager, shy teenager who was, having a rough time at school. And suddenly there were these people who were genuinely nice, and some of them are still my friends today, which is great. But I think there's the rhetoric. There is the structure of, especially I think as a teenager or a young adult, someone's telling me how the world works and nobody else is telling me how the world works. And I think there is a fundamental human need to belong, because that's our survival.
Yeah.
And I think there's also, but I think at a more sinister level, there's a not allowing you to question. And then you stop allowing yourself to question. But also because it's I think a lot of these churches are quite, they're quite wraparound environments. So it's not just your church and your spiritual input, but it's your friendship group and it's your free time, and it's quite often where you're giving your money to, and it becomes your whole world.
And for me, it was my ambition as well.
Yeah, it's your ambition. And you're often being told, people outside, they're not, non-Christians, they couldn't possibly understand. I was told quite a lot, if people don't know God, then they don't really know how to love, which is a direct inversion of a verse in James, which says anybody who knows love has seen God.
Yeah.
To actually completely invert that Bible verse and say that those people don't really know how to love. We know how to love. They don't. I mean, that's a horrifically arrogant thing to say. But I think a lot of narrative around persecution as well. And that keeps you afraid to move out.
Yeah.
Because all those people out there, A, they're going to persecute you, and B, they're all miserable and depressed. Which
is often the reverse inversion as well.
So I think but I think again, why can't you see it when you're in it until you run into trouble? Because when it's good, it's very good. And I also think similarly to a coercively controlling environment, it's really hard. It is that kind of mixture of love bombing and it's the give and take. And actually it's the showering you with love and attention and everything else, and then taking it away and then giving it back. And it leaves you off guard, I think. And I think people are genuinely trying to find God in the midst of that. But it's phrases like, and one of the phrases that came out again and again when I interviewed people was the damage that is done by the phrase speaking the truth in love. Because I think that is responsible. That gives people an excuse for tremendous cruelty at times. But if I can get away with tremendous cruelty and lead you to believe that I'm being loving, that's a dangerous thing, because you can't call me out on it because I'm being loving, and it's that kind of. I think gaslighting is an overused word, but it is kind of gaslighting.
So with you and your experience, if you said it was sort of those nice people that drew you in when you were a sort of not a happy school-going sort of teenager. What was your experience of church before then? How did you,
I think sort of family growing up, it was sort of middle of the road, fairly nominal Anglican, Christmas and Easter a bit.
Yeah.
My grandmother had a very strong faith, very sort of traditional Anglican faith. My mum, not so much. My dad died when I was little. And I think, I just hadn't had much real interaction with church. I think I was probably getting to an age where I kind of thought, well, what is God? Very much sort of high church Anglican school. And that was about the extent of it, really. And I went along on a week-long Christian holiday in my summer holidays. I was invited along. And suddenly there were all these lovely people. And I think it was kind of in some ways, it was a sort of thing of, oh, well, if you're all lovely and if you believe this, then I believe it too, kind of thing. And I really did believe it. I absolutely bought into the whole thing very sincerely. Worked for a mission agency for quite some time, which was pretty hardcore. People kind of tended to get chewed up and spat out, or just, managed to make it work for them somehow. But yeah, I think I kind of thought, well, if this is worth doing, it's worth doing completely. And I think that sort of stops you asking questions too.
Yeah. One of the things which has kind of come up time and time again, and when I've heard what you've been relaying, some people, and especially actually those that are probably 10 years younger than me, and maybe a bit more, have spoken about purity culture. Generally women, but men as well.
Yeah.
And it made me, I had a personal connection with it because I'd just come back from the US. I was working in South Carolina, planting a church, which I then got kicked out from because, I don't know, I think I kissed one too many girls in the time I was there.
Yeah, that would do it.
That did do it. And so I then came back, and for some reason, I don't remember why, but I think it might have been I went for a worship leader job. And I was asked to lead worship at an international church in West London. And the guy that was speaking there happened to be the guy who founded the Silver Ring thing. So this is 2003, and his name was Denny Patton. I just looked up yesterday. He sadly died from cancer a couple of years ago. But the thing which I remember doing, and I met him, and he said, "Hey, you're a cool guy from, you know America, yeah." And I was asked, "Do I want to go on Richard and Judy?" And I said, "Yeah, why not?" Because I was 23 and I just thought didn't really, I'll do whatever. And I remember sitting in Richard and Judy, and Richard happened to be from Romford as well. Mm-hmm. So, and I was kicked out of my makeup seat by, I've forgotten, some chef, I've forgotten his name. And so the whole thing was quite a weird experience, getting makeup put on anyway. And I remember I didn't really know what I was doing. I don't know why I was representing this guy, Silver Ring thing. I didn't really know what it was. And I was asked about abstinence on national TV. Oh. And I could genuinely say at the time, yep, I've abstained from at least most of that. And I think even on there, they said, "So are you a member of the Silver Ring thing?" I said, no, I'm not a member. I wasn't wearing the ring. but I'm here because, I'm a Christian and stuff. And then I began hearing more and more about it. And the very idea, even back then, I thought, why would I wear a ring? This is all a little bit odd. And I remember seeing it as being odd. And then I was a youth worker, so I didn't take the job at the International Church. I ended up being a youth worker in Surrey. And I don't remember teaching anything around sort of purity culture or silver ring thing. I certainly did, because I thought it was just some weird American doing American stuff, of which I knew because I'd lived there for a bit. But the centrality of it in so many people that I've spoken to, and the damage since is astronomical and outside of my understanding. Yeah. So why I'm really, I think that's what I'd like to put a lot of our time into now, because one, it's a real privilege that you sort of come here, but also you're the first woman I've spoken to on video. Yeah. And I don't think it's, if the silver ring thing was created by a man and ignoring who he was, it seems a little bit off. In the same way I can't speak about racial experiences. I've got privilege. I'm not sure I can talk about women abstaining from sex either. I don't know. It's a cultural question in some ways. But what it does, able to speak with you, I can ask you, with your understanding of speaking to plenty of people, also as a woman who grew up in that environment. So what on earth, and it's still, how pervasive, it's still pervasive now, right? It's still
pretty pervasive, yeah.
So,
and as you say, I mean, it really was, and I think probably still is, a very, I mean, the things that I remember from my sort of early experiences, and not so early experiences of being in those kinds of church circles was, Jesus loved you and died for your sins. You're not worthy, and don't have sex before marriage, because if you do, no one will want to marry you. You'll be impure. You'll be dirty. And it
was those three things.
Yeah, it was like that was such a central part of the whole thing, and I think as a shy 14-year-old initially, that went straight over my head, because I was like, well, I'm barely even kissing boys anyway at that stage, but it remains such a sort of central part of the whole thing, and it's almost like the worst sin you could commit was to have sex with someone outside of marriage. Consenting or not. And that was the other thing, is I think one of the real, for me, probably the darkest aspect of it is, and there have actually been studies on this, is the correlation between contexts where you have very strong gender roles, and contexts where purity culture or purity tropes are pushed. There's a very high correlation with acceptance of rape myths, the blaming of rape victims, and the failure to see either acquaintance rape or marital rape as rape. So basically seeing it as consensual sex. And I've certainly come across women who were raped by someone else within a church group, who were then made to apologise to the perpetrator for having led him astray. Wow. And I think that for me is the absolute, that is the darkest side of it. Yeah. And it's this, I think it damages men, because there's a thing of, the girls are being told, probably the boys are being told as well, you men can't control themselves constantly, which is a pretty low view of men. Well,
yeah, and so again, using Soul Survivor as an example, we were told we were never allowed, because we all lived in one house. We were never allowed to go into one of the girls' rooms, ever, and always to leave the door open. I remember, in terms of one of the youth clubs that I had a relationship to, like some of my friends went to and things, if any of them dated a girl that wasn't a Christian, they weren't allowed to return until they'd broken up or whatever. So some of them had just left the church because they, whatever size L it was, but they fell in love and left Christianity for good. Yeah. So and then in terms of sex, I remember a couple of the conversations about it, but it was kind of, I suppose, for me, I was so focused on the kind of the stuff I was reading in the Bible about holiness and about being dedicated to God. And there were characters in the Bible that you could read about, and there was a real kind of clarity about that. And I felt like if God's going to use me, I need to be focused on this. So for me, it was a draw to the positive, which was focus on God. Purity culture isn't that. It's focusing on being rubbish.
Not having sex.
Yeah, not having sex.
Well, yeah, and actually more than that, it's focusing on, because it's not even just the not having sex, it's don't have impure thoughts.
Right.
Don't be attracted to anybody. So that's where it's a sort of, there's a normal physiological response as humans, or as living beings, where, we have a sexual response, but that is made into a sin.
Yeah.
And everything else in between, whether that's sort of, too much snogging, or whether that's sort of masturbation or anything else, is all made into this terrible sin.
Yeah.
And actually, it was really noticeable to me when I asked people in the survey, how much in church were you taught about consent? And I think it was something like 4% of people had ever had a positive message about consent, saying that, you need to understand consent, you need to understand boundaries.
Yeah.
It was either just, don't have sex until you're married, and then for quite a lot of people, men have a right to have sex with their wives whenever they want. And a few people had explicitly been told marital rape doesn't exist.
And the men were told that, or the women, or both?
Both. So what you've got is, because you're not considering that people may have sex outside of marriage, then you don't need to teach them about consent, because you're just assuming they won't do it. But of course, people are having sex outside of marriage, and we know, it is kind of well documented now that actually abstinence programs do not work.
Right.
And you get a higher prevalence of unplanned pregnancy in teenagers particularly, who have been through abstinence programs, because often they don't know about birth control. There is very little teaching on consent, so some of that will be not non-consenting sex, but also quite a lot of people I spoke to said, well, if I was using birth control, that shows that it was premeditated and it wasn't just it got out of control and we just couldn't help ourselves.
Yeah.
If you're using birth control, no, you planned this, and that's a worse sin. So actually there were higher levels of assault and higher levels of unplanned pregnancy, which isn't great.
So where are we with purity culture right now? A number of people, I think, it's so wrapped up with their identity and their faith that in order to reconcile who they are, there's a need for freedom.
Yeah.
And a rejection then of all of it.
Yeah. And I don't think it's a difficult one. See, what I'm not saying is it's wrong to not have sex before marriage. I think that's up to the individual. And I think, as I've said before, for some people I've spoken to, they've said, being told I wasn't allowed to have sex, stopped me from being completely rampant as a teenager or whatever, or took the pressure off. For me, certainly, as a shy teenager, it definitely took the pressure off, I think, initially, but there was very much a shaming side to it as well. And I think a healthy sexual ethic will allow people to make their own choices without shaming them, either way. Because, outside of those circles, you can be shamed for being a prude. So, but I think in terms of people who have now noticed the damage of that in their lives, and by damage, I mean things like failed marriages, or several studies which have been done have looked at, I'm thinking particularly of a study which was done by Sheila Ray Gregoire, Joanna Sawatsky, I think her name is, and someone Lindenbach. Anyway,
we can put a link in.
Yeah. They surveyed 20,000 evangelical women in North America, and what they realized was that the rates of sexual pain and sexual dysfunction in women who'd been exposed to purity culture tropes was, I think, about double the rate of women who hadn't been exposed to those purity culture tropes. And that included women who had been exposed to those tropes but not consciously believed in them or followed them. Just even being exposed to that sort of shaming rhetoric was enough to actually cause some damage. And you know, it's they've written a book, but they've also written shorter. They've written an academic paper, very accessible academic paper, looking at some of the damage that it does. And so you're talking not just about someone feeling a bit shamed and it's not very nice and comfortable. You're actually talking about long-lasting physical and psychological or psychosomatic damage, which ruins marriages. And given the pedestal that marriage is often put on in those churches, it's kind of an own goal, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
But deeply traumatizing, I think. And certainly some of the men I spoke to found that actually for them, sort of sex in their marriage was really difficult for a number of years, and they had to go through quite a lot of therapy to get past the purity messaging that they'd heard as well. So it's not just the women.
In terms of you've done a heck of a lot of looking, sort of understanding of this. What are the origins of it? Because you don't find in, I don't know, 2 Kings 3, purity culture.
Thou shalt not have an impure.
It's not there, and the kind of heavy-handed, as you said, it's one of the 3 things that kind of dominated a lot of the upbringing within church that you had, and I did as well, and it's still happening in a number of places. Where does this come from? Because especially as evangelicals, like, we want to understand in the Bible where is it. So how come it took such a central role?
I don't know how it became so central, in that, you know, we are, as humans, we're sexual beings. That's always going to be a part of our life in some way or other, whether, you know, even for people who are asexual, there's an awareness that other people's sexuality functions in a different way, blah, 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 that kind of thing. But I don't, but there are other aspects of us as humans which could have taken a more central part, but hasn't. For some reason, it's sex. I guess money, sex, and power. It sells. In terms of the sort of the current iteration of purity culture, I think the church has always taught, more or less, you don't have sex outside of marriage. But the sort of the embedding of it as a particular sort of culture and a particular teaching within evangelicalism, certainly. There are different, I think it's had different sort of rises across the 21st century. So you get, in America, you get a sort of pushback against the ending of the anti-miscegenation laws, and very much in white churches, a sense that we need to keep particularly white women away from relationships with people who are not white. We need to sort of preserve the purity of the race, kind of thing. And this was at a time, it's after the Second World War, but the sort of early 20th century, those ideas of racial purity, positive eugenics, selective breeding for desirable qualities like whiteness, were nastily prevalent. And some of those ideas and some of the proponents of those ideas sort of carried that forward. So you get the ending of the anti-miscegenation laws in the States, and then later on you get the sort of sexual revolution of the 60s and a pushback against that. And then into the 80s you get the rise of HIV/AIDS and an understandable fear, but a need to sort of protect young people from that. But it sort of it's gotten over and above, protecting people from infection. It's not just you can teach people to protect themselves from infection without a whole culture around it, without having weird daddy-daughter balls and,
or this
teenagers
sort of
wearing rings
thing,
and signing pledges and that kind of thing. So how it became such a big thing, I'm not sure. But it certainly took off. And I think partly because it was monetized, actually. It was industrialized.
You could buy a ring.
You can buy a ring. You can sign a pledge card. You can buy all the books.
Yeah.
I Kiss Dating Goodbye. That obviously that one's now been retracted.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of others which push the same ideas, really.
Yeah.
And which carry those ideas into how to do marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those are pretty horrifying, including condoning marital rape, or blaming women for causing men to stumble, blaming wives for their husbands having affairs, blaming wives for not making themselves look good enough or giving their husbands enough sex, this kind of stuff. And I think that's the real damage comes in the shaming, and the tying of a very particular, very restrictive sexual ethic and gender norms to this is what God wants.
Yeah. One of the things we spoke about on the phone as well was the conversations that I'd had, and I see in myself as well, is that when we were talking about that kind of heavy-handedness, the kind of those three things that you should really pay attention to, you're not good enough, or you need to think about, how you treat your body. You sort of use the word prude, but I think it's more than that. It's afraid. Mm-hmm. And you're taught to be afraid of your emotions. You're taught to be afraid of your desires.
Yeah. You're
afraid to think about how you express yourself. Mm. And I think a lot of the people I've spoken to at length, they say things like, I was a brilliant singer, but no one really wanted to hear me. And some of the women that I've spoken to specifically, and I think that's kind of through a chauvinistic culture that doesn't want to hear the woman that's really expressive and really confident in herself. Mm. And there was a woman I spoke with just a couple of months ago, actually, who she's still really damaged because she felt she has a gift that everyone ignored. And I wonder if there's a connection between that being afraid versus wanting to be expressive. Mm. And the kind of role of sexuality and all of that when you're a teenager and into your 20s, and how do I express that? Like, I watched a documentary last night on, what was his name? Peter Green, the comedian? Right. It's a really good documentary, actually. Yeah. He had a TV show on MTV and stuff. Huge. I mean, he's a really talented guy in loads of like those American kind of comedy films. And he wasn't afraid to be himself fully. Mm. I don't know if I could say that about Christians. Yeah, I think I'd agree. Well, I wouldn't say Christians as a complete blanket, because that's that is a global and very wide phrase. But I think we're talking quite specifically about a particular and quite Western corner of good call. Yep.
The church.
No, you're absolutely right.
But yeah,
my experience. Through my experience of church, I'm not sure I could see the people that were living fully themselves.
Yes, and yet the rhetoric is there that they are.
And I even thought I was.
That gap. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, me too. And yet I would say my life now is much fuller, and my freedom to live, to explore, to think, to question, to have close friends who aren't Christians, that kind of stuff is much greater now. And I've said this sort of a number of times. I think I put it in the book, but it feels on so many levels like all the stuff that I was promised by the Evangelical Church I found when I left. Yeah. Which is, wonderful for me, but also really sad. And I don't think, I think there are people who find that within particular church spaces. But I think there are an awful lot of people who don't find it in the places where it's promised.
And they feel like they've been, or we feel like we've been sold a pup as a result. Mm. So the relationship with God and the experiences of God through services or through prayer, through home groups. I think there's goodness in a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I miss that from not attending. But the calling stuff, the weight on God
And
stuff.
the fear of missing your calling, that was definitely one that
And that was
found.
very much related to the kind of purity stuff.
Yes.
You can
Yeah.
blow it
Yeah, you
with
can
a
blow
bad
it.
decision.
Just, you know, this much off track, and you've blown God's calling on your life. But I also think,
Which isn't biblical at all, because you
No,
see
it's
these
not.
characters in the Bible,
massively blowing it.
you know,
I know, and that's kind of
Impressively
the point
blowing it.
in many ways. That's kind of the point
Yeah.
in many ways, that actually we do blow it. Of course we blow it, but also I
Every
think there's
day.
something about, for me, I think a lot of people, this idea of I have this one calling in my life. A, it makes me afraid to miss it, and B, kind of gives me a sense of the epic about my own life, and it means that actually, just having a normal life, doing a normal job, having a normal relationship, whatever,
yeah,
isn't good enough. And that's quite, it
No.
either makes you feel like a failure, or it turns you into a little bit of a narcissist, because, you know, you've got to live up to the hype.
yeah, you're
really.
right. Yeah, because we were all going to change the world.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And if we were dedicated,
this
we would,
generation.
the new Daniel,
you know,
or
yeah.
the new Esther, or
Revival was always just around the corner.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is a Daniel generation, or this is a Joshua generation. You know, all this kind of,
I thought of one of the women. That's why I said Esther.
yeah. Well, yeah, and it usually was the men, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was always the men.
And the kind of the big hype prophecies were always for the men. But I think it does give you a sense of the epic about your own life, which can be tremendously appealing, especially if you're, you know, a shy and slightly miserable 14, 15-year-old.
Yeah,
But also I think it means that actually the reality of getting a job, paying your tax, you know, passing your driving test, it's you know, a normal but healthy relationship that kind of potters along.
yeah,
Those are, it undermines actually just how good those things can be, because they're not spectacular, and it undermines just the normal things in everyday life. And I think it can allow people to miss the wondrousness of the normal,
yeah.
because we're not all going to be superstars or prophets or
No,
whatever.
no. So you spoke to 160 people, 400 people got in touch. You're still sort of working. Well, you're doing a PhD in theology. The thing which I found incredibly hard, and sort of talking about it from someone who was learnt to listen rather than just talk, I suppose. And before every conversation I had, I sort of said, have you got someone that you can speak with? Because that isn't me. There was a heck of a lot of counselling needed.
Yeah.
When people are watching these videos, when they're listening to you, reading your book, where are people left at the moment? Where are you left at the moment? Because I don't believe I'm going to be the next worship leader anymore.
Yeah.
That everyone will know the name
Yeah.
of. I don't believe I'm going to be the next any of the things that were told, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't. What I want to try and do is how do I still believe I want to glorify God with my life somehow. I don't really know how to do that fully, but I didn't back then either, even though they were all telling me what it looked like. What is it that people, where are they left? Where are you left?
I'm not sure. I think one of the big reasons why I wrote the book, and why I wrote the book in the way that I wrote it, so I sort of phrased it as a collective memoir, was that so many people, I think, leave these spaces which have been tremendous communities for them, and they feel isolated. And one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to give people a sense of solidarity and a sense of, someone else has gone through this, whatever that looks like. Because obviously, when you interview that many people, survey that many people, you get a fair amount of kind of different experiences, but hoping that people could take the book and kind of go, that I recognise, you know, that bit, not so much, I haven't experienced that, but that bit, yes, somebody else gets it. And hopefully I've contributed to creating something around that. But I think, I think finding community is important, just as people, but also as people who have often experienced quite strong community and have perhaps left or are looking to leave or are afraid of leaving. I think a lot of that is happening online. People are finding each other online through podcasts, through social media platforms, using hashtags like, deconstruction or purity culture or whatever. But I think there is a huge need for therapy. And one thing which I think a lot of people found was either they would go to a Christian therapist who would try and get them back into church and make sure they were believing all the right things, or they would go to someone who had never experienced that, who just said, well, why didn't you just leave? And not get how hard it is to leave and how messy it is and how hard it is to leave a community, and actually also the sort of overtones in some cases of coercive control, and a coercively controlling relationship is virtually impossible to leave. And again, that's a really strong term to use, and I'm not using it lightly.
And I think maybe we could finish off by explaining what that is. Because if we've had a conversation that people have found useful, let's finish with something that's properly useful. Mm-hmm. So how do I know if I'm in or have experienced that kind of relationship, and how do I know when it's not good for me?
I think, I want to sort of tread carefully, because I think it's, in law, it is defined as a particular thing. Yeah. And actually in law, it's in British law, it's at the moment defined as purely happening within an intimate relationship or a family relationship. Yeah. And obviously that's not this. But I think there's actually, there are people who are trying to get the law changed to include gangs and cults, which I think it will be a useful step forward. But if you look at the way that, I think to distance it slightly, if you look at the way that a gang operates, it's often, there is some incentive to join. And I think with churches, there's a huge incentive to join in terms of community and people being, genuinely lovely.
Activity as well.
Activity. Yeah. If you have kids, there's stuff for the kids to do, or if you are a kid or a teen, or there's stuff to do and it's cool. And
or
it's cool
there's a stage to stand on.
There's a stage to stand on. There's quite often charismatic speakers.
There's a mission to go to. There's adventure.
Purpose, and you're given a lot of promises, some of which are actually quite unrealistic. But that sense of purpose, and often there is a certain amount of love bombing at the beginning until you're in, and then the demands begin. Right. So you are being wooed, you are being groomed, to put it in a more slightly sinister way. Yeah. But then once you get in, suddenly there are all these rules, and some of them are explicit and some of them are implicit, some of them are implied. And they sort of appear out of nowhere at times.
And some of those things might be the purity thing.
Yes,
they might
absolutely.
Be
you can't leave.
You need to be giving 10% of your money. Yeah. They might be you can't leave.
Yes, so there's that financial control.
You shouldn't be spending time playing football on a Sunday. You need to come here.
Yes, exactly. Isolating you from people outside.
You shouldn't be listening to that music.
You shouldn't be listening to that music. You should be here, not playing football. You're not dedicated enough.
You shouldn't be wearing those clothes.
Those people outside don't understand. So I was actually told as a teenager in a number of Church of England churches, charismatic Church of England churches, that I shouldn't really trust my mother, because she's not really a Christian. From a safeguarding point of view now, that is horrifying. Yeah. To tell a child that she can't trust her parent is a horrifying thing to do, and it certainly contributed to driving a wedge between my mother and I. And I, as someone who's been, a school governor or gone through various safeguarding trainings now, if a child came to me and said that they'd been told that,
Yeah.
I would be really shocked, and I would feel responsible to do something about that and report it.
Yeah.
But I think it's that, and I don't think everybody was told that, but certainly it's that sense of you can't trust the people outside, isolating you from outside contact.
Yeah.
Don't have a relationship with a non-Christian, you know,
Yeah.
this kind of thing. We're the only ones who understand. That persecution narrative, which often comes into play.
And I even heard something I was told about when I joined a church working. We have covenant relationships, which
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of like, oh my goodness, what does that mean?
Yes, covenant relationships. And I don't think there is, I could be really wrong here, but I don't think there's actually anywhere in the Bible where humans have covenant relationships.
No.
It's God and humans, or it's a nation and humans. The other thing was
But they
the
rubber,
soul
that's a
ties.
rubber stamp, isn't it? Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
it is.
soul ties. Oh,
I don't know.
gosh.
I mean, and that again, you know, we were told, you know, if you sleep with someone before you're married to them, you'll have a soul tie with
Yeah.
them. The only time in the Bible where two humans have their souls knit together
Yeah.
was David and Jonathan.
Right.
So that's, you know, that's something to chew on, isn't it?
Yeah,
But,
get reading.
Yeah. But yeah, I think all this kind of stuff, and the sense that we have the truth and they don't.
Yeah.
And by they, that also included other Christians who don't believe like we do.
Sure. Yeah.
So
totally.
and so
did.
actually, if we have the truth and they don't, if you're constantly being told you have to submit to the authority of your leaders, because that's a big one again, submit to authority. God's put these leaders in place. You need to submit to them.
Yeah.
Well, my leaders are the ones who speak for God. Actually, that really makes you open to being controlled.
Yeah.
And it also means that, you know, further down the line, your leaders can make up any old ad hoc theology or give you any conspiracy theory, for instance, and you are primed to believe it.
Or who to vote for.
Or who to vote for, and not to question that.
Yeah.
So I think it's, you know, it is this, it's a number of factors all brought together. There was someone, Robert J. Lifton, I think his name was, he wrote in the 1960s, he actually wrote about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but applies it more widely to controlling environments. There was a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, I think. But he identified sort of 7 factors which make for a sort of totalitarian system, really, and which allow people to essentially undergo brainwashing.
Right.
And I'm not claiming that churches are necessarily brainwashing, but this was really...
But that was a critique I used to hear
Yeah.
from friends that weren't Christians.
Yes,
I'm not
so
into
they
that
don't- yeah.
because it's all brainwashing.
Yeah.
You'd
But
be like,
when
no,
I-
it's not.
Yeah, I mean, when you,
I'm not
if you-
brainwashed.
If you go to Wikipedia or you look up that book,
Yeah.
and it gives you these sort of 7 pointers, and I read through these and I thought, that's the mission agency I worked for, and it wasn't an Anglican agency. Yeah, that's the mission agency I worked for.
Right.
That's some of the churches I've been in. I can absolutely see how these 7 things play out in those environments, which was quite a wake-up call,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Well, big time. So you've kind of, and I think, yeah, we could another time, or have a look at it online. But we can go through that. Okay, I've been in a coercive environment. The thing which upsets me a bit, that sounds rubbish. The thing that has upset me a lot, is the truth of it, is when people have said, I was in this environment, and what we just described then, I experienced in a number of ways, and other people have experienced very much. It's like a complete rejection is the only way. How, and you distinguish between Christianity and the stuff we're talking about, but so many of us aren't able to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. I do think that there are a lot of people who sadly have been so traumatized by the church, by Christian theology and how it's been applied, that actually it is healthy and good for them to leave.
Yeah.
And they need to do so. And absolutely no problem with that. And I don't think, I just don't think I think we make our own way in the world, and I think we need to figure out what is healthy for us, whether that looks like staying in some form of Christianity, and that doesn't even necessarily need to mean a church.
No.
Or whether it means leaving, or whether it means joining something else, or not joining something else, or, you know, communing with the birds, whatever. I think there is a level of hurt. I think that people have had things so twisted that actually, absolutely, some people definitely need to leave. And even for people who have not been necessarily that hurt, actually, if they come to a point of going, you know what, kind of done here, and I don't necessarily believe this anymore, well, absolutely fine. I think that coming out of a controlling environment, the last thing that people need to do is to be told how to unpack their faith, how to unpack their experience. They need to be told that they have the freedom to do so, and that is their journey.
Yeah.
And figure out, you know, healthy ways to interact, to sort of integrate what they have been through. But actually, I don't think people need to be told what to believe or any of that.
And back to the point that we made in the middle. The word Robert Thompson and I were using, which I just really like. It's not new necessarily. Well, it isn't new, but we're made to be flourishing. We're made to flourish.
Yeah.
And it just seems so opposed to a lot of my experience growing up. I was made to flourish. I was like so many of us, it's like putting a plant in a terrarium. You know, you can grow to this level.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. And I think, flourishing, freedom, etc. And I think this is partly what I mean when I say the stuff that I was promised, I've found since I've left.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've come across people who don't believe in any kind of divine and are flourishing, and people for whom their idea of the divine, of God, whatever, has just massively changed and expanded, and for whom perhaps the word that they use for that now is love and not that God or whatever, and everything else, and people who've become pagan, or people who've become, you know, a bit woolly and can't really be bothered to think about it anymore. I think it's fine, as long as people are flourishing and finding ways towards a path of flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah. How do we finish? What's the... I feel like we've just got one thing we can say just to finish it, and I can't figure out what it is.
I think I don't know. I mean, I think that going on a path of, for want of a better word, of deconstruction, or of maybe walking away from controlling environments, it's hard because it involves some serious unpacking. But I would say it's worth it, and that actually, you know, it's worth going through perhaps the fear of that. There are good people and friendly people outside of that who are happy to help people flourish.
I mean, you've really helped me, just finishing there for me to conclude, from my perspective, you really helped me understand. So deconstruction is such a annoying term that's like, you know, I studied postmodernity, everything else. That's not really me.
Yeah.
You know, but walking away from an environment that wasn't healthy, that's kind of normal.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think, you know, everyone says journey, or, you know, we were talking about pilgrimage as what I'm trying to explore. There's a sense of movement in faith. But walking away from something that is not good for you isn't deconstruction. That's just healthy.
Yeah. And also recognizing that actually walking away from something that's not healthy isn't necessarily a straight line, because frankly, my, you know, journey, for want of a better word, looks more like a plate of spaghetti. But that's fine.
Yeah.
Actually, most people are just trying to figure life out, aren't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, there are still good people in churches, but there are also good people outside it. And bad people.
Great. Thank you. Cool.
Sure.
Cut.